right, so today we're diving deep into something pretty fundamental. The Four Noble Truths of Buddhism.
And, they might be more familiar than you think, even if you're not a Buddhist.
Right. They're about practical wisdom more than like religious dogma, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like a framework for understanding, suffering, basically.
Okay, and we've got this passage that breaks it down in a way that I think will surprise people.
It definitely did for me.
Have you ever felt like you're just stuck in this cycle of stress and you just can't get off? Like a hamster wheel or something?
Oh, all the time.
Well, the Buddha had some pretty insightful things to say about that. But it starts with understanding how he saw the problem in the first place.
Right, and it's fascinating how he positioned himself, almost like a doctor.
A doctor for what?
Well, he was diagnosing and treating these, what he called spiritual illnesses.
Interesting.
And his goal was total liberation from suffering, which, is a pretty bold stance.
Yeah, it is. A lot of philosophies just kind of accept suffering as part of life, like it's inevitable.
Exactly. But the Buddha was like, nope, we can get rid of this completely.
Wow. But I'm guessing he didn't just hit people with the Four Noble Truths right off the bat.
Oh, no, definitely not. He believed in preparing the mind, so it was a gradual thing.
So how did that work?
Well, there was a series of teachings. He'd start with the joy of generosity.
Okay, so helping others and stuff.
Yeah, then he'd move on to the benefits of living a virtuous life, being ethical and all that.
Right, makes sense.
And then he'd touch on the limitations of those sensory pleasures that we all chase after.
So things like, I don't know, indulging in too much food or partying all the time.
Exactly. Stuff that feels good in the moment but doesn't really lead to lasting happiness.
So basically, he was building a foundation first.
Yeah, easing people into a mindset where renunciation or letting go of certain attachments wouldn't seem like this crazy idea.
That's smart. But how did he connect all of that to suffering, the core of his teaching?
Well, he saw suffering as this kind of pervasive sense of something's not quite right.
Even when things seem good on the surface.
Exactly. Like there's always this underlying feeling of unease or dissatisfaction.
And he believed the root of that was craving.
Yes, or tanha, as it's called in Pali.
But not just any desire, right? Like wanting a promotion at work isn't necessarily a bad thing.
You're right. It's more about this clinging, grasping kind of desire.
Like, I need this to be happy type of feeling.
Exactly. That sets us up for disappointment because we're putting all our eggs in one basket.
And that creates a cycle, right? Like ignorance leads to craving, which leads to suffering, which just reinforces more ignorance.
Precisely. We get stuck in this loop, always wanting the next thing, thinking it'll finally make us content.
So how do we break free from that? Is that where the Four Noble Truths come in?
Yes. But they're not just a description of the problem. They're more like categories for understanding our direct experience.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we often get lost in these big philosophical concepts like being versus non-being or trying to define the self.
Right. Those can be pretty confusing.
And they can be rabbit holes, leading to more confusion and ultimately actions that don't really help us.
Because defining the self is like trying to nail down Jell-O, right? It's always changing.
Exactly. So the Four Noble Truths, they offer a more grounded approach.
Okay, so they cut through the philosophical noise and focus on what we can actually experience.
Exactly. Stress and its cessation. These are universal experiences no matter what you believe.
So the Four Noble Truths are relevant to everyone, regardless of their background. It's not some exclusive club.
Exactly. That's part of what makes them so powerful, even after all these years.
They're about real life, not just theories.
Precisely. And to fully grasp their power, we need to delve into each truth specifically.
And how they work together, because it's not just a random list, right?
Right.
So let's start with the basics. What is that first noble truth all about?
Well, the first noble truth states that life is inherently stressful. It's often translated as suffering or dukkha in Pali.
Not exactly a cheerful way to start, is it?
Well, it is honest, though.
True.
And the duty that comes with this truth is to comprehend it.
Comprehend it. So not just acknowledge it intellectually, but really observe how stress shows up in our lives.
Precisely. You can't really fix what you don't acknowledge.
That makes sense. So it's not about wallowing in misery. It's about being really honest that stress is a part of life.
Exactly. And then the second noble truth, well, that's where we identify the root of this stress, which is craving.
Okay, but this is where I think a lot of people get tripped up. Does abandoning craving mean giving up on all desires?
That's a common misunderstanding. It's not about eradicating all desire.
Okay, good. Because that doesn't sound very fulfilling.
No, it's not about that. It's about letting go of a very specific kind of desire. The clinging, grasping kind.
The kind that fuels the suffering.
Exactly. So wanting a promotion because it aligns with your goals and you're willing to put in the work.
That's different from desperately needing that promotion for your self-worth.
Yes, you got it. It's about finding a healthier relationship with desire.
So kind of like becoming aware of our desires and figuring out which ones are driving us crazy versus which ones are healthy.
Exactly. And that brings us to the third noble truth, which states that the cessation of stress or nirvana is actually possible.
Okay, finally some good news, but how do we get there?
Well, that's where the fourth noble truth comes in. The path, or the way out.
So it's not enough to just accept that suffering can end.
Right. You have to actively do something about it. And that's what we'll explore in part 2 of this deep dive.
So if you're ready to move beyond just knowing about suffering and actually start doing something about it.
Stick with us.
Yeah.
We're about to get to the practical stuff.
All right, so we're back and ready to dig a little deeper into this whole path thing. Last time we talked about those four noble truths. Life is stressful, craving is at the root of it, suffering can end, and there's a way to get there. But the path itself, that fourth noble truth, that's the Noble Eightfold Path, right? That can seem, I don't know, kind of mysterious.
Yeah, it can be.
You think?
But it's also very practical. It's not just about intellectually grasping these concepts, but really putting them into practice in our everyday lives, like engaging with them.
So it's not enough to just acknowledge craving like we were talking about before. We have to actually do the work of letting go.
Exactly. And, that active engagement, it's crucial for really understanding how craving causes suffering.
How so?
Well, think about it like reading a cookbook versus actually cooking. You can read about all the ingredients and techniques, but you only truly grasp the recipe when you're in the kitchen, making mistakes, figuring things out as you go.
Oh, I like that analogy. So recognizing the duty, that second level of knowledge we talked about, it's not just following rules, it's more like experimenting.
Yeah, exactly. You're experimenting in the laboratory of your own life.
So we're becoming scientists of our own suffering.
You could say that. You're developing this sensitivity to the causes and conditions that lead to your own personal brand of suffering,
And we're all going to have our own unique recipe for stress.
Of course. We all have different triggers, different habits, different ways of reacting.
So figuring out the ingredients of our own suffering is key.
Exactly. It's about figuring out what makes you tick, what sets you off.
Okay, so the Buddha gave us the diagnosis and the treatment plan, but we're the ones who have to do the therapy. And the Noble Eightfold Path, that's where the therapy part comes in, right?
Yes. And it's not so much a rigid set of rules, It's more like these guidelines for living a life that naturally leads to less suffering.
Can you give us an example?
Well, take right speech, for instance. It encourages us to communicate in ways that are kind and truthful, even when we're stressed out.
Think about a recent argument you might have had.
Oh, yeah.
Would applying right speech have changed how that played out?
For sure. It's about pausing before you speak, choosing your words carefully, and trying to understand the other person's perspective.
So not just reacting in the heat of the moment.
Right. And what about right action? What do you think that's all about?
Action. I'm guessing it means acting in ways that benefit ourselves and others, even when it's tough.
You got it. It's about making choices that align with our values and with this understanding of the Four Noble Truths.
So knowing the right thing to do ain't actually doing it, even when it's inconvenient.
Yes. It's easy to talk the talk, but walking the walk is where the real transformation happens.
So we're talking about building good habits, both mental and behavioral.
That's a great way to put it. And the more we practice these principles, the more we cultivate these qualities like patience, compassion, wisdom.
Which are the antidotes to craving and ignorance.
Exactly. It's like we're actively rewiring our brains, training ourselves to respond to life's curveballs in a more skillful way.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. But there's more to this path, right? We mentioned 3 levels of knowledge for each truth. What comes after recognizing the duty?
Yes. The third level is realizing that the duty has been completed. It's that aha moment when intellectual understanding becomes lived experience.
So it's like the knowledge becomes embodied. You're not just thinking it, you're living it.
Exactly. It's knowing with complete certainty that you've truly comprehended the nature of stress, for example, not just as a concept, but as a felt reality.
Wow, that sounds like a profound shift in understanding, but doesn't that imply that we can actually complete these duties, like reach a point where we've mastered them?
It's not so much about mastering them,
Yeah.
as it is about integrating them into our being. And as we progress on the path, something really fascinating happens.
Oh, what's that? Do we get a prize?
Something better than a prize. The distinctions between the Four Noble Truths themselves begin to dissolve.
Wait, what? I thought those were distinct categories. Life is stressful, craving is the root, and all that.
They are, at least initially, but as our understanding deepens, as we experience the interconnectedness of everything.
Those distinctions start to blur.
Yes. Think about learning about all the parts of a bicycle separately, the wheels, the handlebars, the pedals. But then finally, you get on and ride it.
And suddenly, all those pieces come together.
Exactly. You're no longer thinking about the individual parts. You're experiencing the bicycle as a whole.
I see what you mean. So even the path itself, with its tools for meditation and discernment.
Those can eventually become just another form of attachment.
Wow, even the tools we use to free ourselves can become a trap.
It's like using a raft to cross a river.
Yeah.
Once you reach the other side, you don't carry the raft on your back, right?
That's powerful imagery. But if the distinctions dissolve, what are we left with?
That's where the image of the Dharma wheel comes in. Remember, it has 12 spokes, representing the 12 permutations of the Four Noble Truths and the 3 levels of knowledge.
So each spoke is like a different aspect of this path.
Yes.
But they all converge at the center of the wheel.
Precisely. And that hub, it symbolizes the point of non-fashioning, where the cycle of suffering ends. All those seemingly separate truths and practices.
They're ultimately pointing to the same underlying reality.
Beautifully put. Like all those different paths up a mountain, they might take different routes, but they all lead to the same peak.
Okay, that makes sense. But I think we need to bring this down to earth a bit, make it relatable for our listeners. How do we actually apply these truths in everyday life? Where do we even start? That's what we'll explore in part 3 of our deep dive.
Because even though this path leads to liberation, it all begins right here, right now, with the choices we make in each moment.
Okay, so we've climbed this mountain of understanding, explored all these concepts, but the real challenge is how do we actually apply this wisdom to, our daily lives?
Right, yeah. It's time to shift gears from the abstract to the practical.
Exactly.
So let's think about those everyday frustrations we all face.
Oh, I know those all too well.
Traffic jams, disagreements.
That never-ending to-do list.
Ugh, don't remind me.
Well, those are actually little glimpses of the First Noble Truth, that, stress is just part of life. It's woven into the fabric of our experience.
Okay, so we're surrounded by mini dukkha's all the time. Got it.
Yeah.
But how does the second noble truth, the craving part, apply to these situations? How does craving play into those everyday annoyances?
Well, instead of immediately reacting, just take a breath. Observe the craving that's fueling those frustrations.
Okay, pause and observe. But what am I looking for?
Ask yourself, what kind of craving is this? Is it a craving for control? Craving for things to be different than they are? Oh, the craving for control. That one definitely gets me.
You mentioned earlier feeling called out by that one.
Yeah?
Have you noticed any other flavors of craving popping up in your life?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The craving for approval. That's a big one. Sometimes I feel like I'm constantly bending over backward trying to please everyone. And the Buddha also talked about that craving for non-existence, right?
He did.
Like when things are tough, that desire to just check out, escape from it all.
Exactly. He was really insightful about identifying all these subtle forms of craving.
Yeah. So we're trying to spot these cravings, but then what?
Well, the key is to simply notice them without judgment, just observe them. That very act of observation, it creates a gap.
A gap between
the craving and your reaction. It gives you a little space to choose how you want to respond.
Okay, so it's like hitting the pause button before we launch into our usual stress response.
Yeah.
But what do we do with that pause? How do we actually change our reaction?
That's where the fourth noble truth, the Eightfold Path, comes in handy. Remember right speech.
Right speech, yeah. Speaking kindly and truthfully, even when it's hard.
Exactly. So instead of snapping at the driver who cut you off in traffic.
I could take a deep breath and let it go.
Exactly. Or if you're facing that craving for approval, maybe right action would suggest setting some healthy boundaries, learning to say no when you need to.
So the Eightfold Path is less about strict rules and more like a collection of tools. Tools to help us navigate those challenging moments.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's about making choices that align with our understanding of these truths.
And the more we practice these principles, the stronger those mental muscles become, like patience, compassion, wisdom.
You got it. We're training ourselves to respond skillfully to difficulty rather than just reacting blindly.
Okay, I'm seeing how this applies to those everyday things. But what about those bigger challenges, grief, loss, major setbacks? Can the Four Noble Truths really help us with those?
Absolutely. Although it might not feel like it at first,
Mm.
in the face of really intense suffering, that instinct to resist, to deny, to bargain with reality.
Yeah, it's so strong.
It is. We want to run away from the pain,
Mm.
push it down, anything but feel it.
Yeah, I get that.
But the Four Noble Truths, especially that first one with its corresponding duty to comprehend suffering,
Yeah.
well, they teach us that healing actually starts with leaning into that discomfort.
Wait, so we're supposed to just lean into the pain? That seems counterintuitive.
I know, it can feel that way.
Mm.
But allowing ourselves to really grieve,
Mhm.
to feel the loss, without trying to fix it or push it away.
That's the first step.
It's essential. It's like allowing a wound to breathe so it can heal properly.
But isn't dwelling in the sadness just going to make it worse?
The key is to observe those feelings without getting completely swept away by them. Mindfulness can help us recognize that even intense emotions, they're impermanent.
They come and go.
Exactly. They arise, they linger, and then they fade.
So there's a glimmer of hope, even in the midst of grief, knowing that this feeling, no matter how intense, it's not going to last forever.
Exactly. And that understanding, it can be incredibly liberating. It doesn't diminish the pain, but it does help us hold it with a little more perspective, a little more balance.
So instead of asking, why me, or getting stuck in anger and resentment,
We could focus on acceptance and finding a way forward.
this has been such a powerful conversation. The Four Noble Truths aren't just some ancient philosophy. They're a guide for navigating, well, the whole human experience.
A living guide, for sure. They offer a path to greater peace, a path to freedom, but not by promising a life without challenges.
Right, but by giving us the tools to meet those challenges.
With wisdom and compassion.
And the best part is, this path is open to everyone.
It is.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, I'm left with one question for our listeners. Where do you see those subtle forms of clinging and craving in your own life?
Yeah, think about that.
And what small steps can you take today, right now, to move toward greater peace, greater freedom?
It's amazing how these teachings are like so old,
Right.
but still totally relevant to like what we deal with today.
Seriously, it's like the Buddha was a time traveler. Okay, so let's jump right in.
Yeah, let's do it.
With the first noble truth, dukkha, now.
Mhm.
I kind of get that it means suffering, but it feels like it's...
Oh, it's way more than just pain.
Yeah.
Dukkha, it's like this deep unease
Okay.
that's kind of woven into like everything.
Like a background hum.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Right.
even when things are good.
Yeah, I get that. Like that feeling of never being totally content.
Yes. And the Buddha's big insight was that understanding this like underlying unease
Okay.
is actually the key to like finding freedom.
Whoa.
He uses
yeah.
really powerful analogy to explain it.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Imagine like a watering hole in a forest.
Right. Okay, I'm picturing it.
And all the animals representing our subconscious tendencies,
Okay.
they all eventually come there.
So the watering hole is like where all our hidden stuff comes out.
Exactly. By like watching our reactions to discomfort, we start to see how our minds work.
That's a cool way to look at it. So instead of like running from pain,
Right.
we can use it to like learn about ourselves.
Absolutely. It's all about becoming aware of those patterns that keep us like trapped.
Gotcha. So where do the 5 clinging aggregates fit in?
Oh, those are key. So we've got form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness.
Okay, that covers like everything.
Exactly. They're like the building blocks of our experience.
Okay, so basically everything we experience,
Mm-hmm.
like physically and mentally, is part of these aggregates.
Yes. And the clinging part is when we like grab onto them.
Like they're gonna last forever.
Yeah. As if they were like permanent and solid and would like make us truly happy.
Which we know they don't.
Exactly. It's like trying to build a house on shifting sand.
Yeah, you're never gonna get a good foundation that way.
And that's what fuels the fire of suffering.
Ooh, I like that fire metaphor.
It's like we keep adding fuel to the fire.
But the fire is just gonna keep burning and changing.
Right. So what are the specific ways we like add fuel to this fire?
Yeah, good question.
The texts talk about 4 main types of clinging to sensual pleasures,
Okay.
to views and opinions,
Mm-hmm.
to rituals and routines,
Okay.
and to the idea of like a fixed self.
Like, this is who I am.
Yeah. And it's all rooted in this mistaken belief that happiness comes from things that are
That are going to disappear eventually.
exactly impermanent and constantly changing.
Okay, so it's not the pleasures themselves or the views or the routines that are like the problem.
Yeah.
It's our attachment to them.
You got it.
Like thinking they're going to bring lasting happiness.
That's where the suffering comes in.
This is starting to make so much sense.
Good.
But it also feels kind of daunting.
Yeah.
Like letting go of clinging sounds amazing.
In theory,
Totally. But how do we actually do that when we're like bombarded with messages telling us to want more?
right, to be more, to achieve more.
It's like our whole culture is built on clinging and craving.
It's a tough one for sure.
Yeah.
That's the big question, right? Like, how do we actually live this stuff?
Yeah, it's like, okay, Buddha, I get it, but how do I deal with like
Right.
social media and the pressure to like be successful and all the, temptations to buy stuff?
Oh, yeah, our culture is like a masterclass in clinging and craving.
Totally.
Oh.
So how do we like use these ancient teachings to deal with all that?
Well, instead of feeling overwhelmed, let's see how they can actually help us find some peace.
Oh, I'm listening.
So take social media, for example.
Uh-huh.
How often are you just like scrolling and comparing yourself to everyone else?
Oh my gosh, all the time.
Right. Looking for validation through likes and comments.
Yeah, it's like this thirst that never gets quenched.
Exactly. That's craving and action, pure second noble truth, the origin of suffering. But the Buddha gave us this amazing antidote,
Okay, tell me.
mindfulness. So instead of just like automatically grabbing your phone,
Yeah.
every time you feel that urge, try just pausing, taking a breath,
Okay.
and noticing
Okay.
the craving without judgment.
So like become aware of the craving instead of just giving in.
Exactly. And you know what that awareness does?
What?
It creates space for choice.
Oh, that's interesting.
You can then decide, hey, do I really want to engage with this right now?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there something else I could be doing that would be like way better for me?
Okay, I can see that. So it's not about like throwing your phone away. It's
Yeah.
about being more mindful of how you're using it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about like the pressure to achieve? It's like everywhere you turn, it's all about success and status and being the best.
That's where the third noble truth comes in cessation of suffering.
Okay.
It's about realizing that real happiness doesn't come from like external achievements.
But like our whole society is built on that idea.
I know it's tough,
Uh-huh.
but it's about cultivating inner peace and contentment.
Okay, so like no matter what's happening around me.
Exactly. Regardless of your circumstances.
That sounds amazing, but
not easy.
I know. Yeah, but I guess that's where practices like mindfulness and meditation come in.
You got it.
Yeah.
They help us shift our focus from like external validation.
To like inner peace.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They help us reconnect with that sense of well-being that's always there.
I like that. But I gotta be honest, I'm still kind of stuck on the letting go of clinging thing.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
Like I get it in my head, but putting it into practice is hard.
Oh, for sure. It's like one thing to understand it,
Right.
but to actually live it is a whole other story.
Totally. Like with consumerism, for example.
Mm-hmm.
How do we stop wanting all the stuff?
Right. When we're surrounded by ads telling us we need it all,
It's like impossible.
it's tough.
It-
But again, it comes back to awareness.
Okay.
So next time you feel that urge to buy something new, just pause and ask yourself, what need am I trying to meet with this? Is it a real need or am I trying to fill some void?
Ooh. That's a good question. I've definitely fallen into that trap before.
We all have.
Yeah.
Thinking that buying something new will make us happy.
Yeah, and it never does. I'm curious, have you ever struggled with this yourself?
Of course. Like we all get caught up in wanting. Sometimes I remember this one time.
Hold on, before you tell that story,
Yeah.
I think we need to talk about dependent origination.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
It feels like a really important piece when it comes to understanding like,
How craving works.
yeah, and how to like break free from it.
Absolutely. Dependent origination is like key to Buddhism.
Okay.
It explains how everything is interconnected.
Okay.
And how suffering arises from all these causes and conditions.
So it's not just like one cause leads to one effect.
Right. It's way more complicated than that.
More like a web.
Yes. A giant web of interconnected factors.
Here's that butterfly effect thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like a butterfly flapping its wings can cause a hurricane.
Wow. So dependent origination is like that, but like on a cosmic level.
Exactly. It's about how everything in the universe arises depending on other things.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. But how does that apply to like my own suffering?
Well, remember those 4 types of clinging we talked about?
Yeah.
Those are all part of this web of dependent origination.
Okay.
So let's say you're scrolling through social media
Here we go again.
and you see a picture of your friend on some amazing vacation.
Ugh, I hate when that happens.
Right. And that image, because of your past experiences and desires, it triggers those feelings of envy or inadequacy.
Ugh, yeah. Like suddenly my life seems so boring.
Exactly. And then that feeling of inadequacy leads to craving.
For a better life.
Right. More possessions, more validation, and then that craving.
Makes you do things you probably shouldn't.
Exactly. Maybe you overspend or you obsess over creating the perfect Instagram post.
Ooh, yeah. Been there.
So you see how it's all connected.
Yeah. It's like one thing leads to another.
And it all goes back to clinging.
Okay, so dependent origination is like a map that shows us
How our thoughts, feelings, and actions are all interconnected.
and how clinging to those things just keeps the cycle of suffering going.
Exactly.
Well, wait, there's got to be a way out, right?
There is. And the good news is that understanding dependent origination
Okay.
actually gives us the power to break free. By seeing the causes and conditions that lead to suffering, we can start making different choices.
Like what kind of choices?
Well, instead of getting swept away by craving,
Right.
we can choose to be mindful.
Okay.
We can choose to focus on what we're grateful for.
Instead of always wanting more.
Yes. So it's not about eliminating desire completely.
Okay.
It's about transforming our relationship to it.
So becoming aware of those clinging patterns.
All right. And making choices that lead to more peace and freedom.
That sounds like a much better way to live.
It is. And that's the essence of the 4th noble truth.
The path to liberation.
You got it. It's not like some magic formula.
Okay.
It's a journey of self-discovery, cultivating wisdom, compassion, and skillful action.
Wow, this is all so insightful.
It is fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, but also a lot to process.
Oh, for sure.
So what's like a one thing our listener could do today
Right now.
to start applying all this to their own life?
So what do you think? What could someone do like right now to start putting this into practice?
That's a good question. I guess one thing that comes to mind is just like paying attention to those moments when you feel that urge to buy something you don't really need.
Yes.
And instead of just automatically giving in, like actually stopping and asking yourself why.
Exactly. Like what's
Yeah.
driving that desire? What am I hoping to get out of this?
Right. It's like becoming more aware of those patterns of clinging that we've been talking about.
Totally. And that awareness is like the first step to breaking free.
Okay, so awareness is key.
Yeah.
Willed it. But you know what? This whole conversation about dependent origination has got me thinking.
Oh, yeah. What's on your mind?
Well, if everything is like interconnected and always changing, what about the self? You know, that sense of me that feels so real.
Oh, that's a great question. And it takes us to one of the most profound teachings in Buddhism,
Okay, hit me with it.
the concept of anatta or no self.
Okay, now you're really going to blow my mind.
Well, it's not as crazy as it sounds.
But wait, does this mean Buddhism is saying that I don't exist?
It's not about denying that you have experiences and memories and a sense of identity,
Okay.
but it's challenging the idea that this self is like a fixed, solid thing.
So it's not that I don't exist, but it's more about seeing the self through a different lens.
Exactly. Instead of thinking of yourself as like a rock, think of yourself as a river.
Oh, a river.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Constantly flowing and changing.
I like that. That makes a lot more sense than a rock.
Right. Because we are always changing.
Totally. And I can see how clinging to the idea of a fixed self,
Would cause a lot of suffering.
yeah, because things are always going to change whether we like it or not.
Exactly. Clinging to a fixed self creates this sense of separation.
Like, between me and the world.
Yeah. And that leads to all sorts of problems.
Fear, attachment, suffering, the whole shebang.
It's like we're trying to hold on to something that's constantly slipping through our fingers.
So if the self is more like a river than a rock who's steering the boat.
That's the million-dollar question. And it brings us right back to dependent origination.
Okay, I'm following.
Remember how we talked about our actions arising from all those causes and conditions?
Yeah.
Well, the same applies to our sense of self.
So it's not like there's no one in control,
Right.
but the captain is always changing.
Exactly. Shaped by all these different influences.
Our experiences, our thoughts, our feelings, everything.
Yes. And while we may not have complete control over all those factors,
Okay.
we can still cultivate a sense of agency by understanding how they shape us.
I see. So it's about recognizing that I am not some fixed entity,
Right.
but rather a dynamic process always evolving.
Beautifully said. And this understanding can be so liberating
Really? How so?
because it frees us from the limitations of a fixed identity. and allows us to embrace change and growth and connection.
Wow, this has been an amazing deep dive.
I agree. We've covered so much ground.
From the Four Noble Truths to dependent origination to no self, my mind is officially blown.
It's a lot to take in. I know.
Yeah, but it's so fascinating.
It is. And the journey doesn't end here.
Right, this is just the beginning.
Exactly. So what's one key takeaway you hope our listener will remember from this deep dive?
I think the biggest thing is that the Buddhist teachings are not about escaping the world.
Yes.
They're about understanding it more deeply.
It's about waking up to reality as it is.
And finding freedom from suffering by letting go of clinging.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And remember, the path to liberation is available to everyone.
That's a beautiful message. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, listeners. We hope you found it as insightful as we did. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world of ideas.